Welcome all. In this video I will explain vectors, and when we create a variable of data type vector, in this variable we can store multiple elements. So imagine that we have a program where we want to hold 1 million integers. What we can do is create a lot of variables like this, so 1 million integers. However, you can imagine that this is not very efficient, and to do this more efficient, we can create a vector, so creating a single variable in which we can store all these 1 million numbers. So how we can create a vector is as follows. So we start by typing vector, then less than, greater than symbol, and in between we define the data type of the elements we want to store in this vector. So if you want to store a number, a whole number, you have to use the data type integer. When you want to store a decimal number, you have to type here double. What you also can do is store multiple pieces of text in a vector. Then you have to use the data type string. Yes, so depending on what type of data you want to store in the vector, you have to choose the related data type. So if you want to store all numbers, you have to use the data type int. So this is the data type, and then it follows with the variable name. So I use the variable name v, and then a semicolon. So the first thing that we can do with a vector is printing the number of elements in the vector, or getting the number of elements in a vector. And to do so, we have to use the following syntax, which is v dot, and then size. And that follows with rounded brackets. So this here returns the number of elements in the vector, and to print it we have to use cout. So on this line we print the number of elements in the vector. So let's run this program. And you see it prints 0, because here on line 11 we create a vector. However, when we create a vector, it has no elements yet. So on line 13, when we print the number of elements by using the size function, it prints 0, because again it has no elements yet. So let's add an element to this vector, and to do so we can use the function pushback. Yeah, so type v dot, so v is the name of my vector, dot, and then pushback, then rounded brackets, and between those rounded brackets we type the element we want to store in the vector. So since we are working with integers here, so we want to store numbers in this vector, we have to type a number here, for example the number 10. And let's now print the size of the vector again, so the number of elements in this vector. And what we see here, it prints 1 next. And to clarify this more, let's add some new lines. So it prints first 0. So here on line 13 it prints 0, because the statement here before we made a vector, but it has no elements yet, so therefore it prints 0. And on line 15 we add a single element to the vector, so a single number, which is the number 10. And on line 17 we print the number of elements in the vector again, which is 1 this time, because we added 1 number to this vector. So what we can do is add more elements to the vector this way. So therefore we have to use pushback multiple times. So we can add some random numbers here. Note, an integer can also be negative, so -20 can also be stored in this vector. And let's print the number of elements once more by using the size function. And now you see it prints 5 here. So first 0, because on line 13 there were no elements in the vector. Then on line 17 it prints 1 because we added 1 element to the vector on line 15. And after we add 4 more elements to this vector, so therefore it prints 5 here on line 24. So let's draw this graphically. So therefore I have the whiteboard here, and what happens here is that we create a vector v, and every time we use the pushback function, what happens is that it creates a piece of memory and stores the element in this piece of memory. So the first one would be 10, because on line 15 we use the pushback function for the first time. So this element is added first to the vector, and every time we use pushback, a new piece of memory is being created, and the element is added to this piece of memory. So next, the number 5 will be added here. So in total there will be 5 elements in this vector, which are numbers 10, 5, minus 20, 30, and 2. And the next thing we can look at is how to get a number from the vector. So we created a vector now with 5 elements. And for example, if you want to have the first element here, we have to use the following syntax, which is v. So the name of the vector, then squared brackets. And when we want to have the first element, we have to use the number 0. So this is what we call the index. So we place the index between the squared brackets. And with the index, we point to a certain element in the vector. And when we want to have the first element, we have to use the index 0. So this is the index. And when we want to have the second element, we can use the same syntax, but then we have to use index 1. When we want to have the third index, we have to use index 2. And so this pattern continues. Yeah, so again, when we want to have the first element, we have to use this syntax. So v, square brackets, and index 0. So let's see how that works here in code. So we can print a single element. So let's print the first element. Then we have to use the syntax v, square brackets, and then index 0. So when we run this program now, you see it prints 10, because 10 is the first number that we added to the vector. And with index 0 here, we ask for the first number in the vector, which is 10. Yeah, so again, when we want to have the first element here, we have to use this syntax, which we also duplicated here. So we can also print the other elements. So using the same syntax, but this time with indexes 1, 2, 3, 4. So when we run this, you see here printed 10, 5, minus 20, 32, which are the same as the numbers here in our vector. So the last thing what we can do with a vector is changing an element in the vector. And to do so, we have to use the following syntax. So imagine we want to change the first element. Then you have to type the name of the vector, then square brackets, and then the element that you want to change. And if you want to change the first one, you have to type index 0. And then we can say is equal to 8. So what happens when we execute this statement here? The first element, so which is 10 for now, is then overwritten by 8. Yeah, so in the first element changes from 10 to 8. And finally, we can print this element by using the same syntax as we have seen before. So now if I print v0 on this line, it should print 8, because one statement before we changed the first element to 8. Which we see here. So that's it for this video. So in this video we have seen how we can use a vector.